And Jack Fisher is over here. He's going to take the microphone here in a minute. And it's not his first time speaking to our society, to our group. And it's not his first time speaking about history in the Eastern Sierra. Several times at least 3 times at the Eastern Sierra History Conference. Yeah, on various topics, including, we mentioned this earlier, that his book that was written about the stories behind the effort to stop a road from being built through the Sierra from basically Mammoth over to Fresno side. And real good book. I noticed today, I went back and looked, 19 or 19, 2011? 2011 it was published. And I'm glad I got this back. I passed it along with my, because it's got his signature in it and it's a treasure for me. So Jack is going to speak tonight about the effect of the world wars on the Eastern Sierra and vice versa. I may not have got the exact title right, but I am looking forward to this. I saw him speak last fall at the history conference, and on a related subject about the air bases and military folk who came all the way from Europe to go fishing in the Sierra and this and that. We'll see what he has to tell us about all that tonight. So, Jack, you've got it. Welcome.
Well, the knees and the back dictate that I not stand at a lectern. So I know you'll appreciate that, some of you. Okay, closer. So it's great to be back. Let me introduce you or reintroduce you to Grace Harmon, who's my partner as I'm Alice Harmon. Slip of the tongue. She does have a granddaughter. There is Alice accompanied me here at my first presentation to you, 6.5 going on 7 years ago. That was her first visit to the Eastern Sierra, mind you, a San Diego native, by the way. We are often accused of being a cute couple. The second question is, how long have you been married? Our answer quickly and happily is 108 years, but not to each other. We both lost our primary partners about the same time. And so the very first trip we took together was me bringing her up to introduce her to the Eastern Sierra. That was a special event for me and others because it was when I brought a basket back to Alan Blaver. Anybody here in the Blaver family or descendants of, or can tell me, I understand he did pass away. Yeah. That was a basket that my late wife, who was a basket collector, had snared from an auction in San Francisco, that Alan was there and was not moving quite quickly enough, having never been to an auction before. Neither had we. But we heard from him afterward, and we made a pledge that the basket would come back to the family. So that was the presentation before I talked to you, I guess, about the road story. And we're not going to talk about the road story tonight. What I thought I would do is begin to qualify myself. This is a time of rampant misinformation and disinformation, right? So how can I be qualified to talk to you about this topic? Well, number one, after I walked away from my academic career in surgery, I decided to go back to school and study history. No, I did not earn a PhD. I did the PhD reading, and I did write something associated with it, but a master's degree was sufficient. And the most important thing I learned was that the research is the fun and the writing is the work. I think you'll agree. Everybody who writes books will agree. And I learned how to use a digital library, and that was a big plus. Although I must say that my learning at that time did not include QR codes. So I would be in the dark with respect to that. Now, I am not a native of Eastern Sierra. Jenny Smith used to always like to stress that she was only a visitor to the Eastern Sierra, even though a very pervasive and important one. But my family and I came up here almost every year since 1977. We were a skiing family, a hiking family, a backpacking family. So, and we usually focused we owned property in Mammoth for a short time on Forest Service land. So I got to understand and know a lot about the area and take an interest. And I wanted to write a book. So that was the first book. And Bob Schatz, a builder in Mammoth and also operator of Lake George, the Woods Lodge on Lake George. He put me onto that road story initially. And of course, I was able to do it when sources were still living. Jenny, Ike Livermore. And when you have living sources, of course, that's so valuable. But I learned to work in the archives as well. And a lot of Jenny's papers were already at the Bancroft. The Bancroft helped me a great deal. So that was how I got to that book. I haven't done anything of a writing nature since, except writing up some of the presentations at the historical group, which is in a digital journal, right? So what are we going to do tonight? If you attend those conferences regularly, you're going to hear a little bit of repetition, although I've tried to expand on some of the topics. I spoke initially about events during the World War II when I spoke about a fishing trip. The title, if you look it up, is Gone Fishing, the military brass in the High Sierra. And I'll touch a little bit on that story tonight. Then subsequent to that, I gave sort of an overview of impact of World War I and World War II. And that was when you invited me to this group the first time. That was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and I just couldn't make the connection. So when you invited me again this year, I thought maybe I would try to do that with some additional information. And then either last year or 2 years ago, I focused entirely or mostly on the Bishop Airfield and what happened there during the war. Now, let's begin. This is mostly an aviation story. So I should remind you that first flight in a manned self-propelled device was 1903, the Wright brothers. And over the next decade, there was additional mechanical and technical development that made flying still risky, but a little safer and a little safer. And World War I broke out in 1914, but we didn't get into it until 1917. And airplanes, or flying machines, as they were called then, did not play a major role in the World War, but it played some role. And so when that war was over, the stories of the dogfights between the pilots and their planes almost set people into a frenzy of wanting to participate, and that led to the barnstorming days of flying. Now, World War I did not impact significantly upon the personnel or the people living in the Eastern Sierra for the following reason. It was right at the very beginning of the drain of water from this area. This was still a very flourishing zone with a lot of produce. And there was a demand for food during the war, not just for this country, but for starving Europe, so that there was a lot of farm production. And when people were drafted, early in 1917 when we began to muster an army, it was easy for the young men of the Eastern Sierra to ask for and receive a I'm searching for the word. Deferment, a deferment. That doesn't mean that some didn't go off and fight, and there was some loss of life, but it was not great. It was not great. So now, one other thing is happening in that era. In fact, in 1916, that was the year that tungsten was discovered in the Eastern Sierra, in the hills immediately behind Bishop. The Pine Creek mine wasn't found immediately. If you start up that highway, you come into the area called the Tungsten Hills, and there's even a tungsten road there. It was later on that the major production of tungsten came out of the Pine Creek mine, and I think it was last year or 2 years ago that we heard a presentation from someone solely about the Pine Creek. Has he written that up, or is there a book now about that or not? So I don't need to tell you too much more about it, except if that's a new story to you, take into account that tungsten is a chemical element, not a compound. It has the highest melting point of any element in the periodic table. And all you have to do, and I don't understand this, only a metallurgist would, you have to only put 2% of tungsten into steel, and the entire alloy then becomes a very high temperature material and is perfect, of course, for higher velocity, much higher heat weapons. And toward the end of the First World War, it was the Germans who discovered tungsten alloys, and that was when the power of artillery began to accelerate and became enormous by the time World War II came. So that was the importance of taking tungsten. The Pine Creek mine was one of the largest sources of tungsten in the entire world. Now, that mine, we learned from that presentation, of course, wound down around 1990, I think it was. But we have to take into account that the mining of tungsten was a major contribution from the Eastern Sierra to World War efforts. A sad story, really, when you think of the impact that made on human life. Now, let's consider what goes on after the First World War, when planes are now, flying machines are becoming a little bit safer and affordable. And those were the barnstorming days. And the Eastern Sierra played a role in that. First of all, airfields began to appear up and down the Eastern Sierra. There was an airfield in Olancha. There was an airfield in Inyokern. There was one in Lone Pine. There was one in Independence. And, of course, in Bishop as well. Now, airfields were very simple. They weren't much more than dirt strips. There weren't any terminals. There weren't any navigational aids. They were essentially dirt strips. But they were a way that recreational flying could take place. There was a movie made in the 1930s called Airmail, and they used the airfield in Bishop, and some stunt pilot was able to land a plane, fly through a hangar, come out the back end, which of course was outfitted in very thin cardboard, only to appear like it was a genuine, and back out the back end. The clearance for that flight was inches. They shot it in one take, 6 cameras, and they said it's all or nothing. And if one wing clips any part of that structure, it's all over. But the pilot, relatively new, flew it perfectly. And you can go online and find that film. Somebody did that for me. Airmail is the name of the movie. And I'm forgetting the name of the pilot. He became very famous afterward. Big Ben? It was not Wiley Post. No, no. So that's one example of a barnstorming event. Now, commercial aviation became available in an interesting year, 1929. The Ford company made a Ford trimotor. It was the first passenger commercial airplane, held about six passengers. And some company financed an airline, Nevada Airlines, and made arrangements for flying from Reno to Los Angeles for $50. And they would land in Bishop for refueling. I learned in economic history that you always have to correct for inflation. So multiply by that by about 20. So that would be the equivalent today of $1,000 to fly a small airplane as a passenger from Reno to maybe prices will get back up there again someday. Who knows? Anyway, what happened? They got their license. They started flying in September of 1929, Nevada Airlines. And what happened in October? It was the stock market crash. So they lost their funding. And that was the beginning and the end of the initial effort at commercial aviation in the Eastern Sierra. I think we've been struggling with commercial aviation ever since. Every time the Fisher family came up to Mammoth, about the time we got to the grade, and we were approaching the famous and notorious Mammoth Yosemite Airport, I said, okay, we'll give a prize for every 757 you see parked on the apron, because the city of Mammoth, of course, initially thought that they would be a destination resort that would bring 757s into that airport. I don't think one has ever, but that I digress. I refuse to make any more comments about that airport. Now, the other thing that's happening in 1930, the Versailles Treaty ended World War I with enormous restrictions placed on Germany, which they largely ignored, and ignored to an accelerating degree when Hitler became the chancellor. What they did in the 1930s was to begin training pilots in very large numbers. They came out of the World War I. It was called the Great War, by the way, until World War II came. Coming out of the Great War, they recognized that flight would be important in future conflicts. So they began thinking in terms of a military air force, even in the 1920s. By the 1930s, they were training enough pilots, and our military was aware of that a program was established to train pilots in this country as well. Now, there was a civilian pilot training program, and they needed airfields, and they used airfields right here in the Eastern Sierra. Nationally, the goal was to train 20,000 pilots. They picked college students, gave them a subsidy for training in the summer, and Bishop's Airport became very active in that training program. Now, Pearl Harbor, of course, changed everything in this nation, everything. All of a sudden, there had to be a major mobilization. We had gone through several years of denial, I think it would be an accurate term, about the buildup, political denial, not military denial. The military knew what was happening, interestingly enough. But politically, we had a big faction in this country. America Firsters was the phrase that was used. And Lindbergh was very much a part of that. But Pearl Harbor, of course, changed it all. This was an attack that meant for an enormous degree of mobilization. What is my qualification for talking to you about World War II? I consider it my war. Believe it or not, I was alive during World War II. My earliest memory in life was Pearl Harbor Sunday. I can still picture it. My parents and the people that lived up over us down on their hands and knees in our living room with a world atlas, trying desperately to find where was Pearl Harbor. Of course, the atlas would only show them Honolulu, but by late that Sunday afternoon, this is in Buffalo, New York, by the way, it was they had figured out was what was going on. Now, what's happening out here in California, and particularly in the Eastern Sierra? Well, all of a sudden now airfields became important now for training and developing a Army Air Corps. So um, the fields that were well, let's talk about Bishop first because I've got those numbers more clearly defined. Bishop became important because it was an airfield at altitude. It was determined very early that most pilots would be trained at sea level. And that's where a lot of the training bases were. But flying at altitude was a special need. And so the Army came in and they closed the airport. This is the same airport that had opened for that first commercial flight, by the way. It was still being used recreationally. It was being used to train pilots. But now the training became much more intense because the training involved a much more elaborate aircraft. And for that purpose, they needed to lengthen the runway. So the runway that was very modest became a runway 7,500 feet long and two other runways 5,000 feet long. That was a big, big commitment in those days. That made that airport larger than the airport at Mines Field. Anybody know where Mines Field is? We call it LAX today, where the runways are now 12 and 13,000 feet long. Four of them, but Mines Field was a very modest facility at the time when Bishop became a major facility. And so a Bishop could take aircraft as big as the B-24 Liberator, and it could take also the B-17s and fighter aircraft as well. A very large runway, long runway. I've never been able to find out its length, but it had to be at least 7,500 feet, was built across 395 from the internment camp in Manzanar. Does anybody here know about that runway or have they seen it? Airfield? Okay. Have you gone? You've driven on it. Okay. Right, almost, correct me if I'm wrong, we found it, but directly across from the current entrance to the monument, Manzanar Monument, if you turn in, you only have to go about 50, 75 feet, and you come to the runway. The concrete is still there. Manzanar Reward Road. Now, what was that field used for? It was the only lighted runway in the Eastern Sierra. It was lit at night. It was for training both pilots and especially navigators so that somebody on that plane was visible, but the navigators were blind and they had to be able to land on that runway. And they did touch and goes all night, every night. Imagine the impact on the people at Manzanar with that racket going on day and night. So it was a training field, and it's interesting. The residual of it is still there. So there's now fields up and down the state are being rebuilt. Why all this attention to building facilities away from the coast? Well, remember, perhaps you'll remember from your reading that soon after Pearl Harbor, there was a great fear that the coastal cities would be attacked next. San Diego went into quite a fright. San Diego had multiple military facilities. The Navy was very well developed there, and there was great fear that there would be a Japanese attack. Of course, what made that no longer feasible was the wonderful Battle of Midway, where we knocked out 4 of the 7 aircraft carriers that participated in the Pearl Harbor attack. And from that point on, Japan had no ability whatsoever to strike out and invade the North American continent. The other feeling was that if the airfields were more centrally located, they would be, if they were under attack, they would be away from population areas. So, Eastern Sierra, people living in the Eastern Sierra were now at risk living near major airfields. So, just to document for you, going from south to north, down in Riverside County, March Field became a major base after the war, March Air Force Base. In San Bernardino, the current logistical airport in San Bernardino was a Army facility. In Latimer Field was the place where all of the aircraft produced by Douglas Aircraft were tested and pilots trained. That is today Ontario's airport, formerly Latimer. Coming up the Eastern Sierra, something very interesting happened to the Inyo Kern Airport. It's no longer visible or real, but the University of Southern California was doing rocket research. And some of that rocket research began right toward the end of the Second World War. They needed a bigger area. They needed a very large area when guided missile rocket research developed or evolved soon after the Second World War. And that, of course, ultimately became China Lake's Weapons Testing Center. 1.1 million acres. It is not only the largest naval installation in the world, no water around, but it is the largest military installation in the world. It's larger than the state of Rhode Island. Now, continuing on up the coast, there's no residual of the field in Olancha. Lone Pine has a functioning airport for general aviation, small private planes. Independence Airport is used by the Forest Service, and they have a helicopter installation there. And a lot of their fire reconnaissance work is out of Independence. There's nothing left of the airfield that was in Big Pine. It was built during the Second World War, not really used a great deal. Bishop, of course, after the war was over, the military forgot about it, and the citizens of Bishop wanted their airport back for multiple use. And it took until 1949 before the General Services Administration freed it up, and it became a private airport again. Although then when the Cold War got going, they released a section of that airport, and it became a helicopter test and training site going on at the same time as private aviation. Now, I skipped past, but I think I will mention because it is such an interesting story about the fishing trip. I was put on to this story. Sources are everything in history, but Lou Roser, who ran the PAC station, was chatting with. No, I went to him first. I was reading Andrew Roberts' history called Masters and Commanders, and it is a overview of the Second World War from the viewpoint of the two masters, Roosevelt and Churchill, and the six commanders, the three chiefs of staff in British and American. Now, interestingly enough, 5 of those 6 chiefs of staff, 3 Brits and 2 Americans, were recreational fishermen. They loved to fish. So that after some of the famous conferences you may have heard of the Casablanca Conference, they went up into the Atlas Mountains in Morocco to go fishing. And after the Quebec Conference, they went up into northern Quebec and they went fishing. Well, I asked Lou Roser about this. Lou was an important source, by the way, Lou and Mary, for the road story, and they were part of the team of road warriors that worked against that road. And he said, "Oh, I know that Joe Booth has written that up." So here is a Forest Service ranger, Joe Booth, and he happens to know a California boy who used to come up fishing, and his name was Henry Arnold. Well, Henry Arnold became Hap Arnold, who was the general of the entire armed Air forces, Army Air Forces. Air Force was not a separate branch during the Second World War for worldwide operations. Now, on August 6th, 1944, one of Arnold's aides appeared at the commandant's office at the Bishop Airport. And it was a major who was in charge of that airport. And he said, "There's going to be a visitation from Washington, and I'm here to do the advance." Well, they thought that the base was going to be inspected. So they rally everybody at that base and start making it look shipshape. If you can make an air base shipshape, you know what I'm getting at. At any rate, for context, for historical context, that's the other lesson we learned in history. Context is everything. August 6th, we are now 2 full months after the Normandy invasion. It wasn't until August 1st that Patton's Third Army was activated. He was held back as a diversion to fool Hitler's troops. So the success of Normandy was not only related to the fact that it was an overwhelming show of force, 7,000 ships carrying material and men and material across the English Channel, but it also was the result of a lot of diversionary work, and one was to hold Patton back. So he now has just landed his army on August 6th, and yet somehow Hap Arnold decides that he's going to take one of his confreres fishing with him in the Sierra. After all of the planning, all of the action is undergo. So, and they're in Washington, and they said it's time for a fishing trip. Well, they didn't get to the Bishop Airport until August 24th. And early that morning, Joe Booth and another Forest Service guy whose name I don't have in my brain, and a couple of other people, plus some of the military people, are waiting in a coffee shop on Main Street in Bishop, and they hear the hum of an airplane arriving, and it is the C-54, later on called a DC-4 when it became commercial. And these are the fancier planes that the general staff are flying around, and they land right on time, 6 a.m. in the morning. And everybody at the Bishop Airfield is standing at attention, ready for their inspection. And out of the plane comes not only Hap Arnold, but Chief of Staff George Marshall. And they say, "Oh my goodness," because Marshall was sort of the kingpin of the three chiefs of service. And they hop into a waiting car. They wave goodbye to everybody at the Bishop Airfield. By instruction, we are not doing anything but going fishing. And up the Sherwin grade they go. And they go right into the ranger station at Mammoth. They pick up a couple of other people. Then they go to the pack station. They get their packing stock, and they are on their way up over Duck Pass. And they climb up over Duck Pass within hours of landing. Now, I know a little something about mountain sickness. I'm vulnerable. If I don't take acetazolamide before I come up for a couple of weeks at Mammoth, I get a headache, a bad headache. And I never did accommodate to it. I have a lot of friends who say it never bothers me. But here are these guys who are working most of the time in Washington at near sea level, and they come up here and go for almost a 20-day fishing trip. Now, that whole detailed fishing trip story is told in online, and I suppose everybody here knows how to get on that. I don't know. To the online journal.
The EC, the history here.
Yes. Isn't that an online? It's not a printed journal. Yeah.
So if you want to know how, get in touch with Sierra Forever.
Okay.
Which used to be.
Oh, I thought maybe you all knew about that. Okay. Okay. Anyway, it is. Say it again. That's where the QR code. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Yes. It was a lot of pack stock. It was a lot of pack. It was a very elaborate and very detailed fishing trip, and they had a lot of success. They had a lot of success. Say it again. I think it was almost 20 days. Yeah, and they came out in Lake Italy. Do you know where Lake Italy is? Way up, right up behind the tungsten mine. I've never been up that high. I've hiked in that pass where the tungsten mine was, but straight up. Marshall, when he came down, he said that was a trail made in hell, and it was very very steep trail down. But they got back out. They had a big dinner, celebratory dinner in Bishop when they came out. They brought a lot of fish out. And then they took the Forest Service people with them back to Washington just to have a tour and visit headquarters because that would have been at the Department of Agriculture. And who's running the war? Well, there's a lot of little side stories to this. For instance, they were having dispatches flown into them by the Women's Army Air Corps flying small planes and knowing and dropping. Yeah. And they were dropping. And there was one dispatch one morning that was so big and so heavy that she overshot. They had to send a party out to find it. And so I'm guessing that maybe that was the dispatch that was reporting all the events associated with the liberation of Paris. At least it's about a concurrent there. I can't confirm that, of course. Anyway, that was the famous fishing trip. Well, let's see. What have I not touched on here? Oh, I wanted to bring the story to your Mono Basin here. And so my question to you is a geography question. Is Hawthorne in the Mono Basin? It's certainly in the Great Basin, but not the Mono Basin. Okay. The other way there. Okay. All right. Well, then they didn't quite qualify. Anyway, you all know about what happened at Hawthorne and munitions, you know. Do you know how that started? It began with an explosion in 1928 in New Jersey. Some people say that it's still the biggest explosion that's ever occurred in the continental United States, but an arsenal somewhere in New Jersey somehow, for some reason, blew up. It was enormous. And so they had to create a new arsenal, and there was enough things going on in the Pacific, and of course we'd already fought a war in the Philippines and at the beginning of the century. So the decision was to put it in a remote place closer to the Western United States. There was one created in the Eastern United States. I forget where it was, but that was the beginnings of the. It was called an arsenal then. It's now called a depot. Now, according to what I have been able to find out, it has been essentially shut down since 1990. It's no longer a production facility, but there's still a lot stored there. Do any of you know any differently? Anyone here follow the Hawthorne story? Still,
Where are they doing that?
The highway closes on 167.
yeah.
They stop the traffic. They trigger what they're doing.
They're not producing, but they're just.
They're blowing. They're getting rid of.
They're not sending it to the Ukraine. Interesting. It's reached its sell-by date. Okay, now you and I had an exchange about airfields up here, and you said you found someone who said there was an airfield just on the other side of Dead Man's Pass. Okay, across from the Obsidian Dome. I looked on all my sources and I could not see that it ever became an army facility. But you know, when I gave this talk at the history conference down in Bishop, there were pilots in the audience who said, "Oh, there were a lot of fields around that we used to use either for emergency or delivering people into for fishing trips or whatever."
If you turn right instead of left, where the Obsidian Dome
Yeah,
is,
yeah,
and go not terribly far into the forest,
yeah.
and kind of bend to the right a little bit,
Uh-huh.
there is definitely an airfield that was created, and evidently they had a refueling depot.
Wow.
They had evidently they did a lot of work on creating the snow moving machines that we use now when the snow really hits.
Fascinating. Yeah.
But it's definitely there.
Now, I understand that your airport here, though, is post-war. When was it formed? Lee Vining's airport. Where did that airport come from? Well, that would be I cannot find it listed in any. There are websites you can go to that list every airfield and then what they became, every military installation in the state, in fact, for the whole nation. In San Diego County alone, there were 50 different military installations during the Second World War. That's how active our county was in it. Mountain warfare, yeah, yeah, yeah.
There's a place where the army goes to blow shit up.
Oh, yeah.
Warning sign. Up here on 160, on the way to Hawthorne. Before you get to the Navy, there's an army location where they say that they have the right to close the highway for 2 hours and blow something up.
Yeah.
There's two different. Okay. One marked Navy.
Well, in quick summary, I think I've persuaded you that Eastern Sierra played a role and took some impact from the war. I'm happy to have any of your comments, questions, and corrections. Historians always have to be prepared for corrections. Well, Edwards Air Force Base, Arnold was involved in buying that land. And it was a small facility, but it became a very, very large facility. That, by the way, is the longest runway in the world, 39,000 feet. 39,000 feet. Of course, it handles the Challengers back in those days. There are no space shuttles now, but it was a lake bed, as was China Lake. But then they made it into a real runway, and it's still very active. It's a test site for photographs.
There's also
for producing aircraft.
There's also George Air Force Base by Apple Valley in Victorville, or southern Mojave. Mojave.
Well, that now is a place where they store aircraft and refurbish them when.
Explains you drive by there and there's a ton of airplanes parked out there.
Yeah. And there's one of those over in Mojave, and of course, I guess there's some in Arizona. They park them in places where it's just completely dry, because that will preserve the equipment the best. I'm told.
That's why we all live to such long ages here too. Yeah.
Questions?
You know where we're doing this.
If I remember right, I was on the same tour with Kathy and Rich when Paul McFarland, one of our locals, showed us that airstrip, and I thought there was something about, it was like top secret, like emergency use if there was an invasion. So we'll try to get info from Paul to share with you. But that may be why it's not in the usual sources. There was something secret about it, as I remember.
All right. Any other questions or comments? Or any observations? There were, at one of the history conferences, there were people in the audience who would reflect on the impact of the war on their parents. You know, they weren't around, but they remember their parents' experience during the war. I was 4 years old on that Sunday, and of course, and the war was over when I was 8. So I can tell you from personal experience that 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds did not play Dungeons and Dragons. They played war. And I had my own foxhole in the backyard, and I had a wooden rifle. And if the enemy came around the left side of the garage, they were Japs. And if they came around the right side of the garage, they were Krauts. Pardon my use of ethnic slurs, but that was the reality of that day. And we would listen by the Philco at night for the reports every night. My dad was too old to be drafted, but he worked in purchasing department for Bell Aircraft, and their principal product was the P-39 Airacobra. And then they produced some experimental aircraft after the war.
One other really local connection, this is Dave Carl talking, about tungsten. Nowhere near as big as the big tungsten mine, but up off of the Tioga Road, if you go into where you can get up into the 20 Lakes Basin,
Yeah.
at the very upper end of it, there was a tungsten mine
Yeah.
that was created and operated by among other people, the Hesses. We have in our outside exhibits at the museum, we've got an electric compressor pump truck that was used at the tungsten mine.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and not Gus Hess, Augie Hess. Well, his military service was as in the Italian side of World War II, the invasion up through Italy, and he was air mechanic, a mechanic on the airplanes. So he's of course one of the founding families of Levining.
Oh yeah.
And this hall over here, this park over here, is named in honor of the Hesses.
I see.
Yeah, they were Gus Hess. His father was one of the founders, the very first people who established a business here.
Right. Sir.
Coming. People out there in the world.
Hi, Rhonda. I have been told, or I have heard that during World War II, there was a quartz mine up in the Laurel Mountain area. Does that ring any bell?
No.
Okay.
No. But whoever gave that presentation was it last year or 2 years ago on the Pine Creek mine? He was very, very comprehensive in his research on mining in this whole area. So he would be a good source for that. I don't know who it was. Maybe David will recall.
Anyone else? Well, I want us to give Jack a big hand. Thank you very much.
Great to be back.
And I'll just say, besides all of the knowledge that he has, he sits down here and without slides to help him remember what's coming next and what to say, he fascinates them, and he does it so well. So thank you.
Thank you. Well,
There's still
I won't be at the history conference this year because I decided to come visit you guys instead. And one trip up a year is now enough for me, although we used to make multiple trips in Daysville.
The conference, though, it's coming.
I assumed you all go there, right? No?
October 31st is Friday and November 1st is the October 31st is the first day of this year's Eastern Sierra History Conference in Bishop at Saracosa College. And Friday, October 31st, our historian Bob Marks will be speaking. I'll be speaking. Yeah, and I'm going to be repeating
The book you just talked about.
yeah,
Great. Great.
talking about his book that's coming.
They didn't put you on a waiting list, I hope.
That's October 31st and November 1st, Saturday is the second day. And then on Sunday, I'm not sure what day it will be, but there will be some field trips are part of the weekend. So it's a really good thing to go to. It's a lot of fun. And I'm going to be speaking also on Friday about, if those of you who remember a couple months ago, I did the Ferdinand talk, Ferdinand Castillo, and we had 100 people involved in that. People came out. And so we're going to do it. I'm going to do it again at the conference. And yeah, David Woodruff, a guy who comes and speaks to us every year as a
Yeah.
character, he's going to be there as Norman Clyde.
And Char Miller probably going to come and talk.
Mark's got another thing to talk fire, I think.
Yeah.
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 Friday's going to be a good day.
Do you all know Jeff Gabriel? Yeah. Jeff was the very first history conference. Jeff was sitting in the back of the room all by himself. And somehow I got to chatting with him. And he was here looking at the job. That was his first look at the ESIA job. And I told him the story about I owned a chalet up at the main lodge, across from the main lodge. And our big bugaboo was finding somebody who could operate all those chalets. It was a sort of a group of owners, and that would last the winter and be able to come back the next year. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe you remember this, but I think the person the year before that took over ESIA came from Vermont and lasted less than a year and left. So I got to talking with Jeff, and he was coming from the Midwest, I think. Huh? Yeah, Kansas. And so he reminded me recently, I gave him a reading list, obviously all of Jenny's books. And I said, oh, well, here's some books that you, and he told me in an email a few weeks ago that he still had the list and he still had all the books and he read them all. I said, well, I hope that oriented you because he's still here. What now? Almost 10 years later.
And ESIA became Sierra Forever recently, and they have expanded all the way north of Tahoe, all of the federal visitor centers and information centers, and of course all the way down south to Lone Pine and down there. So
they had only 9 stores when I started to market the road stories, so they must have a lot more now.
And another reminder: despite the government shutdown, the visitor center is open, and the ESIA or Sierra Forever bookstore is in business and selling. Will be open tomorrow.
Alice and I went there first off to see the chart on the lake level, and of course it was a locked door. So tell me, what's the story on the lake level at the moment?
Maybe we should wrap it up. The lake is dropping at the moment.
Oh dear. Oh my.
Let's just have a formal close of the meeting and a reminder for November the 3rd, I think.